The turkey smelled perfect, and the betrayal smelled worse. My daughter stood at the head of my own dining room table, my table, in my house, in the home where her father had spent the last 22 years of his life, and she raised her wine glass to announce, warmly, sweetly, that the family had made a decision about my future. I could tell she'd rehearsed it. She had that particular stillness she gets when she's trying to control a situation. The same look she gave her third-grade teacher when she'd forgotten her homework, innocent and confident all at once. My daughter has always been convincing. That was never the problem. I let her finish. I even let my son-in-law nod along from his chair, like he was seconding a motion at a city council meeting. Then I reached for the manila folder I'd placed beside my plate that morning, when everyone was still arriving and hanging coats in the hallway. "Before we eat," I said, "I have something I'd like to share with the family, too." My son-in-law stopped nodding. My daughter's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. "Let me take you back to September," I said, "because that's where this really started. 34 years ago, my husband Lyle and I bought the house on Sycamore Lane in Portland's Laurelhurst neighborhood for $127,000. We were 32, newly married, and we'd saved every spare dollar from his job at the Transit Authority and my first year of teaching salary at Riverbend Elementary. The house needed work. The kitchen was outdated, the backyard had gone wild, and the master bath had avocado green tile we lived with for 6 years before we could afford to replace it. But it was ours, and we loved it the way you love something you had to fight for. We raised our daughter in that house. She learned to ride a bike in the driveway. She had her first heartbreak in the bedroom we'd painted yellow for her. We celebrated holidays and graduations and the ordinary Tuesday evenings that become precious only after enough of them have passed. Lyle died 2 years ago. A heart attack, sudden, a Tuesday morning in October. He was 63. He was brushing his teeth. I was downstairs making coffee. After 30 years of marriage, after every plan we'd built together about what the rest of our lives would look like, I had to learn how to be in that house without him. I figured it out. I want to be clear about that. I am 66 years old. I still substitute teach 2 days a week. I garden. I walk 3 miles most mornings. I remember every student I've ever had. Their names, their faces, the ones who needed extra time and the ones who didn't. I am not struggling. I am grieving, which is a different thing entirely, and I was learning to carry that grief the way you carry anything heavy, carefully but steadily. My daughter called more frequently the first year after Lyle died. I was grateful. By the second year, the calls had tapered. She and my son-in-law had their little boy, my grandson, who was 2 by then, and the absolute best thing in my life, and they were deep in the exhausting work of early parenthood. I understood. I didn't press. So when they drove up from their condo in the Pearl District that September Sunday for dinner, I was genuinely glad to see them. I'd made pot roast, my son-in-law's supposed favorite, and I'd bought juice boxes for my grandson, who spent most of the meal carefully removing peas from his plate and hiding them under his napkin. The conversation about the house came up over dessert. My daughter said she and my son-in-law had been talking for a while, actually, and they were worried about me being alone in such a large house. The maintenance, the yard work, the stairs. She said it so gently, reaching across the table to put her hand over mine the way she used to when she was small and wanted something. "We just think it might be time to consider a smaller place," she said. "Something easier to manage on your own." I asked what kind of smaller place she had in mind. My son-in-law leaned forward. He's always been the one with the plan. He mentioned a senior living community out in Lake Oswego. All the amenities, very active social calendar, independent living apartments. He'd already looked into it. He had the name ready, which told me this hadn't been a spontaneous thought. I said I didn't need a senior community. I said I was perfectly capable of managing my own home, had been doing exactly that for 2 years, and had no intention of leaving. My daughter looked at my son-in-law. He looked back at her. "We love you," she said. "We're just trying to think ahead." I told her I appreciated that. Then I changed the subject, because something in that exchange, the look between them, the prepared name, the hand across the table, felt rehearsed in a way that made my stomach go quiet and tight. They left before 8. My grandson was asleep in his car seat. I stood on the porch watching their taillights and told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't. 3 weeks later, my closest friend, Thelma, called on a Wednesday evening. Thelma taught 4th grade at Riverbend for 28 years. She's known me since I was a first-year teacher in a classroom 2 doors down from hers, and she is constitutionally incapable of softening news she thinks you need to hear. "I was at Coava this morning," she said, naming the coffee shop near her apartment, "and I saw your daughter." I said that was nice. She was with a man I didn't recognize. Real estate type, nice suit, tablet on the table, talking numbers. Thelma paused. She was talking about the Sycamore Lane property. Square footage, comparable sales, what a kitchen renovation would do to the asking price. I sat down on the stool by the kitchen island because my legs felt unreliable. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I was 3 tables away," she said. "I'm sure." I called my daughter that night. Asked if she'd been meeting with a realtor about my house. She said Thelma must have misunderstood. She said she had a friend in real estate she'd run into, and they might have briefly discussed the general market. But it wasn't what it sounded like. Her voice was smooth and reasonable, and I almost believed her, except that I've known her for 30 even years, and she has a particular flatness in her tone when she's not telling the truth that I learned to recognize when she was a teenager, sneaking out past curfew. I hung up and called a woman named Carmen Walsh the next morning. Carmen had been recommended by a colleague who'd gone through a guardianship dispute with her own family the year before. She specialized in elder law out of a practice on NW 23rd. I told her what was happening. She didn't seem surprised. "Start documenting everything," she said. "Every conversation, every text, every voicemail. Don't delete anything, and get your medical records in order." I asked why the medical records. She was quiet for a moment. "Because that's often the next step. When a family member wants to establish control over a parent's assets, they typically start by questioning competency." I told her I was 66. "I know," Carmen said, "but these situations don't follow logic, they follow money." I called my doctor's office that same afternoon. 2 weeks later, Dr. Pemberton sat across from me and told me I was in excellent health. Every cognitive marker within normal range, blood pressure slightly elevated, which she attributed to stress. "Better than normal on the cognitive side, honestly," she said. "You remembered the name of the street you grew up on, your first employer, and the capital of Kazakhstan without hesitating." I asked her to put all of that in writing. She looked at me carefully. "Is someone questioning your competency?" "Not yet," I said. "I want to be ready if they try." She sent the report to Carmen's office that afternoon. It was my neighbor Dwight who told me about the afternoon my son-in-law let himself into my house. Dwight is 74, a retired postal worker who has lived next door since 1998 and knows every vehicle that belongs on our block. He knocked on my door on a Wednesday evening, looking apologetic. "Your son-in-law was here this afternoon," he said. "A couple of hours. I figured you knew, but your car wasn't in the driveway, so I just wanted to mention it." I hadn't given my son-in-law a key, but my daughter had a spare. I didn't call either of them that night. I called Carmen. She told me to change the locks immediately and document what Dwight had witnessed. I had new locks installed the next morning and a security camera at both doors by afternoon. I called my daughter and told her I'd need my spare key returned. She said I was being dramatic. The key arrived by mail 4 days later. No note. 2 weeks after that, I was checking Zillow on a Tuesday evening, something I'd started doing at Carmen's suggestion, just to monitor the market, and I found my house. My house listed as coming soon. A price, a description, mid-century craftsman with original character and significant upside potential. And photographs, my living room, my kitchen, my back garden, my bedroom. The photographs my son-in-law had taken during those 2 hours, Dwight watched his car sit in my driveway. I called Carmen at 7 the next morning. She had a cease and desist to the listing agent by noon. The listing came down within 48 hours, but I had the screenshots, time-stamped, saved in 3 places. The listing agent, it turned out, had been told by my daughter that she was authorized to act on behalf of the property owner, that I had verbally agreed to list the house and was in the process of relocating to assisted living, that it was a sensitive family situation requiring discretion. Carmen used the word fraud without hesitation. The welfare check happened on a Thursday in early November. I was raking leaves in the backyard when 2 officers came around the side gate. They were polite and visibly uncomfortable. Someone had called in a concern. They wouldn't say who, that I might have left the stove on and had seemed confused when speaking to a neighbor. There was no such neighbor. The stove was off. I had not been confused about anything. I invited the officers inside and showed them the kitchen. I showed them Dr. Pemberton's report. I showed them the cease and desist letter and the screenshots of the real estate listing. By the time they left, one of them had suggested I consider filing a harassment report and handed me a card for a victims advocacy organization that handled elder abuse cases. I stood in my kitchen after the door closed and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, something quieter and more absolute than anger. Clarity. I called Carmen and told her to finalize the trust. The house and my primary assets would go into an irrevocable trust with me as sole trustee during my lifetime. And I changed my will, 60% to a scholarship fund I was establishing at Portland Community College in Lyle's name, supporting first-generation students pursuing teaching degrees. 30% to my grandson in a custodial account his parents couldn't access until he turned 25. 10% to Thelma, who would argue with me about it later and lose. There's nothing left to take, Carmen said, even if they tried every legal avenue available. Good, I said. I sent out the Thanksgiving invitations that afternoon. I cooked all day: turkey, green bean casserole from Lyle's mother's recipe, cranberry sauce from scratch, 2 pies. The table was set with the good china we'd gotten as a wedding gift. Candles in the centerpieces, the cloth napkins I ironed the night before. Everything looked like every other Thanksgiving this house had known. Thelma arrived first with a bottle of Pinot Gris and an expression that said she was ready for whatever came. Dwight came at 5:30 with dinner rolls. A couple from my book club, people who had known me consistently for years, filled out the table. My daughter and son-in-law arrived at 6, right on time. She wore a burgundy dress I hadn't seen. My grandson wore a tiny button-down shirt that made him look like a small professor, and I held him for a long moment in the entryway before anyone said anything else. Dinner started quietly. Whether, the baby's latest words, whether Portland would have a real winter this year. My son-in-law told a work story that went on too long. I passed the cranberry sauce. I poured wine. I did not look at the folder beside my plate. It was halfway through the meal when my daughter set down her fork and pressed both palms flat on the table. "Mom," she said, "we've all been worried about you. I think we need to be honest tonight about what we've been seeing." She talked for several minutes about the difficulty of living alone, about the house being too much to manage, about the community in Lake Oswego, the beautiful grounds, the social calendar, how the proceeds from a sale could fund a comfortable life for years. She talked about how much she loved me and how hard this conversation was. My son-in-law nodded throughout, the same nodding from September. When she finished, the table was quiet. "Thank you," I said. I've been wanting to talk about all of this too. I opened the folder. The first document was Dr. Pemberton's assessment. I read the relevant section aloud. All cognitive markers normal to superior, no evidence of decline, patient fully capable of managing her own affairs. I set it on the table. My daughter started to speak. I held up one finger and continued. The second document was the screenshots of the real estate listing. My house, photographed, without my knowledge. Listed without my authorization. Described as available following a family decision I had never made. I placed it in the center of the table so everyone could see. My son-in-law looked at the photographs for several seconds. Then he looked at the tablecloth. The third document was Carmen's cease and desist letter, which contained the listing agent's written account of having been told that my daughter was authorized to act on my behalf. The word fraud appears 3 times in this letter, I said. I want to be precise about that. My daughter tried denial. The listing was just exploratory. She'd only wanted a sense of value. She hadn't meant for it to go live. She tried redirection. I was making this adversarial when all she'd ever wanted was to help. She started to cry briefly, and I watched my son-in-law look away from her when she did, which told me something about how things were between them. Dwight cleared his throat from the end of the table. I can speak to what I observed, he said simply. From next door, the date, the time, how long the car was there. I described the welfare check. I placed the officer's card on the table, the one from the victim's advocacy organization. I said the words elder abuse clearly and watched my son-in-law go still. Then I took out the last document. 6 weeks ago, I said, I established an irrevocable trust. This house cannot be sold, transferred, or taken from me through any legal proceeding. After I'm gone, it becomes the foundation for an endowment at Portland Community College, the Lyle and Fay Scholarship Fund for first-generation students who want to become teachers. I looked at my daughter. Your father always said, teaching was the most underestimated profession in this country. He was right. This felt like the right way to honor that. Nobody spoke for a moment. My grandson, who had been quietly demolishing a dinner roll, looked up and said, "More, please," and Thelma handed him one without missing a beat. My son-in-law stood a few minutes later and said they should get the baby home. He didn't look at me. My daughter gathered her coat and my grandson's things with the brisk efficiency of someone holding themselves together in public. At the door she paused. She didn't turn around. I don't know what you think you accomplished tonight, she said. Nothing complicated, I told her. I just wanted the people who know me to hear the truth. She left without a goodbye. My son-in-law carried my grandson out. The little boy looked over his father's shoulder and waved at me, and I waved back until the door was closed. Thelma helped me clear the table. We didn't say much. Dwight took the leftover rolls home. The book club couple stayed to help with the dishes, then let themselves out with quiet hugs. I sat alone in the living room and looked at the house the way you look at something you almost lost. The fireplace Lyle had rebuilt from the studs. The bookshelves he'd insisted on putting in the hallway. The window seat in the front room where my daughter used to read on rainy afternoons, where my grandson now climbed to press his face against the glass and watch the world go by. I had protected everything I'd promised Lyle I would protect. I'd done it without anyone having to rescue me, because I hadn't needed rescuing. I'd needed to be taken seriously, and I had made that happen myself. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something that never should have had to begin. Spring comes slowly to Portland, weeks of gray and rain before the magnolias give way to cherry blossoms along the park blocks, the city turning pink and improbable. After all that wet, I was planting tomatoes in the raised bed Lyle built when I heard the front gate open. I came around the side of the house, and my daughter was standing on the porch. No son-in-law. Just her, a jacket I recognized from years ago, holding an envelope. We looked at each other for a moment. I wasn't sure you'd open the door, she said. I heard the gate, I said. I was in the backyard. She held out the envelope. I wrote it down because I couldn't get through it on the phone without falling apart. I tried 4 times. I took it, my name on the front in her handwriting, the way she's always written it since she was a girl, with the capital F slightly too large. Can you stay? I asked. She looked surprised. You want me to? I made coffee, I said, the good grounds. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She talked and I listened. She told me things I hadn't known, how serious the debt had become, how her husband had convinced her this was the only solution left, how somewhere along the way she'd stopped asking herself whether something was right and had started asking only whether it would work. She didn't excuse herself. That was the part that mattered most to me. She didn't ask me to understand. She just told me what had happened and let it rest between us. I didn't tell her it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I told her I heard her. We didn't fix anything in 2 hours over coffee. You don't repair 37 years and the damage done to them in a single afternoon. But she hugged me at the door before she left. A real hug, with weight behind it, and I held on a little longer than I'd intended. After she drove away, I stood on the porch for a while. The cherry tree in the front yard was in full bloom. A bird somewhere above me in the branches was singing something I couldn't identify. I stood there and let myself feel everything. The grief, the relief, the long, complicated love a mother carries for a child regardless of what that child does. Then I went back to my tomatoes. There was still planting to do, and the afternoon light was good. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and whether you think some things can be forgiven or only survived.